Nobody in that arena knew his name. He walked in through the main gate on a cool Thursday evening, just as the sun was pulling itself below the hills, and the sky was turning the color of old copper. He wore a plain gray jacket, dark trousers, and simple boots that had clearly seen many roads. There was nothing about him that should have made anyone look twice. No badge on his chest, no team walking behind him, no bag over his shoulder. Just a man, alone, moving through a crowd of 400 of the most powerful fighters in the region, as though he had done it 1,000 times before. The Solrath Arena was not a small place. It had been standing for over 100 years, built first from timber and later reinforced with stone and iron. The floor of the main pit was packed earth, worn smooth by decades of boots and effort. The walls were lined with training equipment, scoreboards, and old photographs of past champions whose eyes stared out at anyone who entered, as if keeping watch. Every Thursday evening, the arena held its open evaluation session, a gathering where fighters of all disciplines came to train, be assessed, and compete for regional ranking. It was serious work. These were not casual athletes. These were people who had spent years turning their bodies into something formidable. Kaelum Draev sat down in the lower stands, at the far end closest to the pit floor. He chose a seat that was slightly apart from everyone else, not dramatically so, but enough that he had a clear line of sight to the entire arena without anyone sitting directly beside him. He leaned back, rested his forearms on his knees, and watched. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. The fighters went through their routines. Trainers called out instructions. The sound of impact and exertion filled the space, the steady rhythm of a place that knew what it was for. Kaelum did not move. He did not speak to anyone. He simply observed, his dark eyes tracking the action in the pit, with the calm attention of someone who had seen every version of what he was watching, and was in no hurry. It was Darius who first felt it. Darius was a heavyweight champion. He had competed at national level for 9 years, and had never lost a bout on this floor. He was in the middle of a combination drill, a sequence he had performed 10,000 times, when something made him stop. Not a sound, not a sight, something else. He lowered his hands and looked around the arena slowly, the way a person does when they are certain someone has called their name but cannot find the source. His sparring partner asked him what was wrong. Darius shook his head and said he did not know. He picked his hands back up and tried to continue. He could not find his rhythm again. In the following 20 minutes, the same thing began to happen to others, quietly, one by one, the way a tide changes without anyone announcing it. A pair of wrestlers near the south wall stopped mid-drill and stood in silence for a moment before either of them spoke. A group of 4 fighters at the conditioning station found that their conversation had dried up without anyone choosing to end it. A trainer named Yessa, who had been coaching in this arena for 17 years and was not a person given to imagination, put down her clipboard and stood very still for almost a full minute. She said later that it felt like the room had become heavier, not oppressively so, but the way the air feels before a large storm, charged with something that has not yet arrived. Nobody looked at Kaelum yet. Nobody knew to. The head of the evaluation session that evening was a man named Oren. He was a former military combatant who had retired into coaching after a long and decorated career. He was known for being unshakable. People in the fighting community used his name the way you might use the name of a stone wall: solid, reliable, not easily disturbed. He called the arena to order at the 90-minute mark and sent 16 fighters into the main pit for the evening's assessment round. They entered the pit and took their positions. Oren raised his hand to signal the start. The fighters looked at each other, set their stances, and then nothing happened. It was not hesitation. Hesitation looks a certain way, the small flinch, the eyes that flicker sideways. This was different. All 16 fighters simply stopped, as if the instruction to move had been given to their bodies, but the bodies had decided to wait for a better reason. Several of them described it afterward as a kind of clarity, a sudden and very quiet voice inside them that said, "Not here, not now, not in front of him." None of them knew who him was, in that moment. They only knew the feeling. Oren's eyes swept the pit. He saw the stillness. He saw 16 trained fighters standing like men who had just walked into a cathedral and remembered, in the same second, where they were. His eyes moved to the lower stands, not because anything guided them there, not in any way he could explain to anyone afterward, and they landed on the man in the gray jacket. Kaelum Draev was looking back at him. Oren stood on the edge of the pit for a long moment. He was a man who had been in genuine danger many times in his life and had never once felt his legs lose certainty. Standing there, holding the gaze of this quiet stranger in the lower stands, his legs did not lose certainty either. But something in his chest recognized something, the way you recognize a word in a language you never formally learned. He understood, without logic and without language, that whoever this man was, he was not a spectator. It was Darius who moved first. He walked across the pit floor slowly, his heavy footsteps deliberate, and stopped at the railing closest to where Kaelum sat. He stood there for a moment, then he dropped to one knee. He did not say anything. He did not make a gesture. He simply knelt, his head lowered slightly, his hand resting on the earth of the pit floor. When people asked him afterward why he did it, he had no complete answer. He said it felt less like a decision, and more like the only honest thing his body knew how to do in that moment. He said it felt like telling the truth. What happened next took less than 2 minutes, though many of the people present would later describe it as feeling much longer, the way significant moments always seem to stretch themselves out. One fighter near the center of the pit followed Darius, then 2 more at the east side, then the group of 4 who had been standing at the conditioning station, the wrestlers near the south wall, the trainers, the young fighters who had only just earned their evaluation spots that season, the officials at the scoring tables, 3 of them, older men who had never in their professional lives made an informal gesture of any kind inside this arena. All of them, in a slow and unannounced wave that moved from one end of the floor to the other like a ripple across still water, went to one knee. 400 people. Not one of them had been asked. Not one of them had spoken to the man in the gray jacket. Not one of them could explain it using the vocabulary of logic or training or reason. But every single person in that stone and iron arena, the finest collection of fighters in the region, knelt on the ground and stayed there. Kaelum sat in the stands and watched them. His expression did not change. He did not smile, did not raise a hand, did not acknowledge the moment with any gesture of superiority or satisfaction. He simply looked at the arena full of people kneeling before him, and his eyes were quiet, as if this were a language he already knew and had simply been waiting for others to remember. After a long silence, no one could agree on exactly how long. Estimates ranged from 40 seconds to over 3 minutes. Kaelum stood up. He straightened his plain gray jacket. He looked at the arena one more time. Then he turned, walked back along the lower stands, and passed through the iron gate. It closed behind him with a sound that Oren would think about for years afterward. Not loud, not dramatic, just final, the way a door sounds when someone leaves a room, and you know, immediately and without doubt, that they are not coming back. Nobody moved for another full minute after he was gone. Then, slowly, the arena returned to itself. People stood. A few looked at each other. Nobody laughed. Nobody tried to immediately make it into a story or a joke, the way people usually do when they cannot explain something and want to reduce it to something manageable. They simply stood and breathed, and let the strangeness of what had happened sit in the room for a while, because that felt like the right thing to do. In the days after that Thursday, the accounts began to circulate, not loudly at first. In the fighting community, people are generally slow to speak about things they cannot explain with training or strategy, because the whole culture is built on the idea that results come from preparation and effort, not from invisible forces. But there were 400 witnesses, and 400 people is too many for a thing to stay quiet. Oren was one of the first to speak about it openly. He gave a recorded account to a journalist who covered the regional fighting circuit and who had heard about the evening from 3 separate sources. He said, "I have spent 30 years around fighters. I know what authority looks like when it is performed, when a man raises his voice or makes himself larger, or uses his history to remind you who he is. That was none of those things. There was no performance. He did not try to command anything. He simply was what he was, and the room responded to it the way it responds to a change in temperature. You do not decide to feel cold. You just feel it." Darius spoke about it too, in a recorded interview that became widely shared. He said, "I am not a person who uses spiritual language. That is not how I was raised, and it is not how I think. But I will tell you something honestly. I have been in rooms with very powerful men, heads of organizations, people who have real authority over large numbers of people, and I have never felt anything like what I felt that evening. What was in that man was not built. You cannot build it. It was already his, from somewhere long before the arena. Others described different things. Some said the sensation had felt like peace, an unexpected, deep settling, as though the constant low-level tension that fighters carry in their bodies every day had simply released for those 2 minutes. Some said it had felt like recognition, like seeing a face you know from a dream but cannot place in waking life. A young fighter named Pell, who had only been competing for 2 years, said it most simply, "I knelt because it was true. I do not know how else to say it. Whatever he was, it was true, and kneeling was the only honest response I had." Oren spent months trying to identify the man. He had resources, contacts in regional and national fighting organizations, access to competition records going back 40 years, connections in law enforcement from his military career. He had no competition history, no social media presence, no record in any martial registry in the country. One contact led Oren to a regional historian who specialized in warrior lineages, old family lines that predated formal competition structures, going back to a time when fighting was not sport but governance, when the strongest man did not win a trophy, but became the one others answered to. The historian identified a lineage. It came from a remote northern region, far from the city, from land that had been ruled for generations by a succession of kings, who were also the greatest fighters of their era. The line had gone quiet about 5 generations back, the historian said. The throne, such as it was, had dissolved when the region was absorbed into the larger national structure. But bloodlines do not dissolve. They continue, quietly, through children and great-grandchildren, who may not know what they carry. The name Draev appeared in the historian's records. An old name, a lineage name. Whether Kaelum was truly the last bearer of it, Oren could not say. He never found the man again. No one did. What he was left with, what all 400 people in the Solrath Arena that Thursday evening were left with, was the memory of 2 minutes in which everything they understood about power had been quietly rearranged. Power, as most people understand it, is something you demonstrate. You show your record, you raise your voice, you make others aware of your size, your history, your capacity. The assumption is that authority is a performance, that if you stop performing it, it disappears. That evening at the Solrath Arena proved something different. It proved that there is another kind of authority entirely, one that does not need an audience to exist, one that does not perform because it has nothing to prove, one that walks into a room of 400 trained and formidable people in a plain gray jacket and sits quietly in the lower stands, and before a single word is spoken, the room already knows. The cameras in the arena had malfunctioned that evening. The security footage from the period of Kaelum's visit was blank, not corrupted, not degraded, simply absent, as though the recording equipment had also, in its own way, knelt. There are things in this world that resist documentation. They pass through rooms and leave no official trace, only the changed faces of the people who were present. The man who walked into the Solrath Arena on that Thursday evening was one of those things. He left nothing behind except the memory, carried now by 400 people, of what it felt like to be in the presence of something so completely and undeniably itself that the only response available, to the body, to the instinct, to the deep and wordless part of a person that has been measuring hierarchy since long before language existed, was to bow. Not out of fear, not out of instruction, out of recognition. He was the Alpha King, and the arena, stone and iron and 100 years of champions, had simply told the truth about it.